My suspicion is that they might try to hit some of the shipping areas in the Persian Gulf, or they might try to hit some of the military installations both along the Persian Gulf coast as well as of the ones that are inland, such as an airbase, maybe the one around Esfahan, for example. But that, of course, remains to be seen, and that's not something that the Israelis have revealed to anybody yet.
And Israel has delayed its retaliatory strike against Iran because of a leak last week of potentially sensitive military information from the US. The leak revealed Israel's well advanced plans to respond to a salvo of nearly 200 Iranian ballistic missiles fired against it earlier this month, which was in itself a retaliation by Tehran for Israel's attacks on its Middle Eastern proxy groups. And it comes as negotiations over a potential Gaza ceasefire and hostage release deal are set to resume in Doha, in Qatar, in the coming days. Let's talk to Cedric Leighton, who is a former US Colonel and member of the Joint Staff of the Pentagon, now CNN's military analyst. Cedric, hello and welcome to the programme.
Thank you so much, Henry. Good to be with you.
Now, it's really good to talk about this, particularly at this time. What do you think is going on? Why has Israel delayed its retaliatory strike that people were, or some analysts were very, very concerned about the depth, concerned about the scale of it?
Yeah, there's several reasons, I think. One of them may be logistical, in that the Israelis need to figure out exactly what kinds of forces they're going to be employing, what kinds of targets they're going to be hitting, and when they're going to do that. So part of that, one thing affects the other, and everything affects the timetable. So that might be part of it. The other aspect of this, Henry, could be that they are looking at it from the standpoint of where can they achieve the greatest influence without creating the greatest change in behavior in Iran, without creating a major escalation. And that is, something that, if they do it that way, they're going to need to calibrate exactly what they're going to hit. And the other part of that calibration is if they fulfill the promises that they have reportedly made to President Biden and to Secretary Blinken of the United States, they will not hit the nuclear installations, the research facilities, or the installations themselves, or any oil terminals and oil-related facilities. So if they avoid those targets, that may require a reassessment of what targets they actually can hit, how many, and how often.
Well, some people might say, well, if they're avoiding those targets, what can they possibly hope to achieve if the aim is to change Iranian behavior?
Well, that actually is a really good question. So I think the effect would be limited if the Israelis stick to that idea where they don't hit the nuclear targets or the oil targets. My suspicion is that they might try to hit some of the shipping areas in the Persian Gulf, or they might try to hit some of the military installations both along the Persian Gulf coast as well as of the ones that are inland, such as an airbase, maybe the one around Esfahan, for example. But that, of course, remains to be seen, and that's not something that the Israelis have revealed to anybody yet.
And the Times has reported that the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and its paramilitary force, the Basij, the force of volunteers, are considered to be likely targets. They will surely not wait and be sitting ducks. They will make preparations, won't they?
Normally they would, and the Basij especially have been pretty good at limiting exposure to Israeli strikes. They know how to live again another day, and they are able to really work around a lot of the Israeli strikes. So if it's the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, specifically the Basij, then it would be something that not only would it be survivable for them, but they would definitely be able to have the right camouflage, have the right dispersion techniques, all of those kinds of things that would make it at least a bit more difficult for the Israelis, but not impossible for the Israelis to cause some major damage there.
And as people might expect, there's a major leak investigation by the FBI and I presume the Pentagon as well. What do we know? Is there a prime suspect?
Well, there have been some suspects that have been mentioned, some of them on social media, but then when you dig a little bit deeper, it seems as if those people actually aren't suspects. So that gets to very dangerous territory where people are being accused without actually, perhaps having committed any particular crime or this particular leak. So it seems as if, based on discussions I've had with Pentagon officials, they're no closer to finding a particular person now than they were compared to yesterday or the day before.
And I see that Prime Minister Netanyahu told Secretary of State Blinken during their meeting in Israel that the Hezbollah drone that struck his home at the weekend was, and I quote, an issue of dramatic significance that cannot be ignored. And he says, the US and Israel need to join forces against Iran. What more does he want, do you think, from the US?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and he's using the drone attack on his residence as, basically an excuse for, or basically the basis for a plea to create more of a synergy between the U.S. and Israel. The U.S. does not want to get involved in a war with Iran. And it's doing everything it can to avoid any escalation in the Middle East. And now we're dependent on what the Israelis do, and of course how the Iranians respond. What more would Netanyahu want? Perhaps more weapons. Perhaps the ability to fly his air forces in an area where they've previously had denied access. Those are the kinds of things that he might want, and a lot of that actually depends not just on the U.S. but on what the Arab nations do and say in this particular regard.
And finally, Cedric, I mean, Iran was one of the, 36 countries that was represented in Russia at the BRICS meeting in Kazan. And the Russians wanted to show the West that we're not isolated. And the Iranians, I'm sure, would be pleased to rub soldiers with dozens of other world leaders. What do you think this might do to the calculation, due to the sense that Iran is not on its own, it has allies?
Well, that is actually a very interesting point because what it shows is that Iran's relationship with Russia is definitely in the ascendancy. The president of Iran, prior to the BRICS meeting, the president of Iran met with President Putin. They are clearly engaged in helping the Russians in Ukraine with the Shahid drones as well as other support. And what it seems to me is that relationship has become much more formalized. So you see Iran and, by extension, North Korea being drawn into a closer orbit with the Russians, and that could also give pause to the Israelis. It might mean that they either delay or modify some of their target planning processes, and time goes on, it of course becomes a less strident effort and becomes an effort that is perhaps more of an afterthought than a main goal for the Israeli military.
Okay, thank you very much for your analysis, Cedric. That's Cedric Leighton, a former US colonel and member of the Joint Staff for the Pentagon. He's now a military analyst on CNN.